Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's get into the story. The record begins with a photograph that was never meant to be the last of anything. In it, David Holloway stands beside a weathered trail marker and a low tangle of rhododendron, his face half turned toward the ridgelight. The background is a seam of Appalachian hills that could belong to any county along the border, where the map folds into green and darker green. There is calm in the set of his shoulders, a familiar posture for someone who makes a living stepping, past posted signs that say "keep out" and asking people who do not want to be asked. The timestamp on the image fixes a moment in early fall, the air still warm by midday, the shadows longer by 5. The work of reconstructing what followed relies on the residue he left behind. David was meticulous in a way that makes editors forgive his absences. He kept a voice notebook and a paper field book. He dated index cards with locations and weather descriptions. He habitually dropped pins when there was service and penciled compass bearings when there was not. In the days leading up to his disappearance, he also sent a pattern of short messages to colleagues and to 2 friends back in the city. Messages that sound almost offhand until you listen for what he did not say. David had built a small reputation on stories from the edges. He preferred communities that were not captured by easy shorthand. He spent a winter with a migrant church that met inside a shuttered roller rink, and he spent 3 months shadowing a family who lived by bartering skilled labor across 3 counties. When he pitched this trip, he used the careful language of a promise and a hedge. He had heard about a private people in a pocket of country that had long resisted county mapping crews and lumber outfits and surveyors, and then thrived on the silence that resistance created. He said there were odd details that could be documented without harming anyone, that the point was to understand a belief system rather than to sensationalize it. He also liked the headline he had in his notes, a line too dramatic for the first draft of anything but useful as a spy, the tribe that hunted him down and killed him. He wrote it as a joke to himself, but he wrote it. He entered that country from the south, along a 2-lane that slips from town lights into a bowl of second growth and creek beds. He rented a small cabin behind a feed store where the owner kept 2 aging hounds and a habit of leaving a light on even at noon. The owner, a woman named Martha Bell, said she did not care who he was as long as he did not leave trash on her porch and paid in full before the week was out. He paid cash, as he often did away from the city, and he bought bottled water and a sack of oatmeal and a jar of peanut butter and a bundle of wood he would barely use. In his notebook, he described first impressions with the restraint of someone who has learned to distrust mood. He wrote that the canopy felt close even on the ridge, that the understory was a weave of laurel and galax and nettle, that the creek beds were limestone over clay, and that the mud held prints longer than expected. He wrote that the locals used the word holler without irony, and that they used it with the certainty of a boundary. Some hollers were for families, and some were for logging, and some were for no one. He wrote the word no one 3 times without a period in between. On his second day, he met a man named Roy Pritchard at a breakfast counter. Roy wore a cap with a faded seed company logo and the careful calm of a person who knows how to end a conversation without raising his voice. He said he ran trap lines when the season was right and mended fences for cash when it was not. He said he had seen David's kind before, and that most of them left with footage of fog on the creek and stories that made them sound braver than they were. David smiled in the way he used to de-escalate, and he asked about a symbol he had found painted on a downed trunk near a pull-off. The symbol is in the record because David photographed it several times from increments back along the trail. It is a circle interrupted by 3 short inward cuts, not unlike the petals of a flower cut into the rim of a plate. It is made with something that dried to a chalky white, and in places it carries the sheen of ash. Roy did not look at the photo long. He called it old men's markings and nothing you want on your back. When David asked him to explain, Roy said that some people around there kept old rules and did not want company. He said they kept their rules by reminding you that you had stepped out of yours. David's editor, Ellen Voss, called that afternoon and left 2 messages. The first asked for a general sitrep and a few photos they could use for socials if and when they decided there was a story. The second asked him to send a drop of anything he considered sensitive to the Cloud so they would not lose it if his gear broke in a creek. He answered with 2 sentences about spotty service and a promise to send selects from the cabin after sunset. He did not send them. By the 3rd day, he had walked out a pattern that traced loops through the publicly marked trails and then up the ridges where the map failed. In his paper book, he sketched a hollow that seemed to fold in on itself. He wrote windshield words for later research, words like karst and pit cave and sink. He wrote that the ground felt porous, that a misstep could become a fall you would not stop, that the creek sounds vanished in odd places and then returned too. Quickly, he wrote in present tense when he did not mean to. From this point, the account leans on inference and on the small certainty of artifacts recovered. It also listens closely to a half-dozen voices that spoke to investigators and to colleagues after David was gone. A truck stop cashier remembered a man who fit his description buying extra tape and a whistle. An older couple on a scenic turnout remembered a stringer type with a radio clipped to his belt, and they remembered the way he kept lifting it as if to weigh the silence. Martha Bell remembered the cabin unlocked and the stove unused and a single sock left on the porch rail to dry as if it belonged to a ghost. The next symbol was found on the trail above a creek bend that locals do not name for outsiders. When investigators returned after the fact with the state team and did not find the symbol, they learned that symbols in that country can vanish as quickly as they appear. David, however, photographed it twice. The same circle and petals, marked low, almost at a knee. He also photographed a simple lattice of saplings bent and pinned, barely noticeable unless you looked for it. It is a hunter's trick used for deer, for guiding the body of a moving thing by shaping its options. It will not stop you. It will make you choose a narrow way. In his voice notes, David's tone changes on that day. He uses the phrase, "I may," have found the core, which is standard David optimism. And then he uses the phrase, "I am being guided," which is not. He narrates distances in the way you narrate to remain calm. He names creekstone colors and the smell of a deadfall, and the feel of a low snag on his backpack straps at the same place a 3rd time. He says, "I have marked a loop, and somehow it is still leading me inward." Late that afternoon, he calls an old friend named Marcus Page. The 2 of them worked together years earlier at a city paper and share the kind of shorthand that survives: career changes. Marcus tells investigators later that David sounded focused more than afraid, that he laughed at his own superstition and then admitted he had started to say "we" instead of "I," as if someone else had chosen his route. Marcus told him to pull back to the road and reset the next morning. David said he would after one more ridge. One more ridge can become a ritual if the terrain wants it to. In these hills, a ridge is not a study in up and down so much as a long conversation with slope, and the slope wins whenever it wants. When night came, David pitched his small shelter in a narrow saddle and recorded 3 short entries, the last of which is the most direct. He had been followed, he wrote, not directly, but with the consideration of someone who wanted him to be sure of it. He had found a row of stones that did not belong where stones usually gather, and he had found the circle again painted not on a tree, but on a hunk of limestone pulled from the creek. It looked like a lid set beside a jar. The following morning, his notes thinned to datum rather than narrative. There is a break in the paper where he tore a page loose. There is a tight entry with a bearing and a time, and there is a line that becomes a spine for what comes after. If I am missing, I did not get lost. I am inside someone else's rule. By Midday, locals saw a vehicle like David's still parked at the turnout he had used. By evening, Martha Bell noticed his porch light was still on and his bed undisturbed. By the next morning, Sheriff Ed Hanley had been asked out to the cabin by a call from Ellen, who had been calling every number in David's file. Hanley was not surprised to find an out-of-towner still in the hills. He had a handful of old cases that started with a rented cabin and a trail map and ended with a long drive home and a story told as a cautionary joke. Hanley did not joke much anymore. He called in a small team and walked in from the outer trails. The search teams found what they always find first when someone goes missing in the high country. They found the wrong trails chosen in the right order. They found a tight camp on a saddle and a little trash bagged carefully as if the owner had planned to carry every bit of it out. They found sticks stuck in the ground as directional marks, and they found that those sticks had been moved after they were placed. They found boot prints in small groups of 3 or 4, never a full trackway, and they found smaller prints with no tread, as if someone barefoot had paced the edges of the path like a thought circling a worry. Back at the feed store, Martha showed the sheriff a slip of paper David had left in an envelope addressed to no one. It contained a half-page of names and a page of clean handwriting, an account of a conversation 3 days earlier with an academic he had called for context, a cultural anthropologist named Dr. Claire Whitford. In that account, David summarized what little is known about closed or cloistered groups that form outside recognized structures. He wrote about historical pockets in the hills where families hid from war and conscription and from debt, and then created a grammar of survival that hardened over time into a law. He included a line Claire had offered him as a guardrail. There is a long difference between a people and a myth. Write about the people. Do not feed the myth. The group David hoped to understand existed to him then as more rumor than record. Old church minutes in a locked cabinet hinted at a schism that was not about theology so much as about the right to vanish. A pair of property disputes a century ago dissolved without judgment when both sides failed to appear. Locals told each other a story about guardians of a spring who did not want the creek diverted for a mill, and a story about a boundary made by ash and held by generations who never needed to tell outsiders why. None of that became a map. What became a map was the way the ridge itself seemed to shape decisions. Some who study this kind of thing say the hunt is a story that appeals to outsiders because it organizes fear into an image we can frame. The form of a pursuit is tidy, but in the fragments that make up David's last day, tidiness fractures. What took place had less to do with chase than with slow shearing of options. A bent sapling that suggests the left path will be easier. A cairn that claims a creek bend is crossable where it is not. 3 ash marks on a stone that make an accidental path seem formal. The difference between running and leaving is space. The hills took the space away. At mid-afternoon, a storm formed above the west ridge and left its light in the branches for an hour. When the shock cooled, the ground would have been slick in the leaf litter and the roots would have moved underfoot, like deliberate animals. David's pack was recovered much later near a limestone slump with one strap cut clean and the other torn, as if he had grabbed for the pack as the weight pulled him forward and then let it go. One camera body was missing. Another hung by a lanyard from a branch where he had likely left it to swing for a time lapse or to mark a place only he meant to return. There were signs of other hands. A strip of his bright tape was tied in a neat loop low enough that you would see it only if you were not tall. A small square of heavy cloth, the kind used by arborists, lay on the ground clean of dirt as if it had been set there and lifted again. In one place, the soil showed marks of craft, a lattice like the one beside the earlier symbol, and the faint suggestion of a woven mat that had rested there long enough to press its pattern into damp earth. Nothing there felt like a camp in the way outsiders camp. Everything felt like a hinge. In his last voice note, a fragment that survived on a corrupted file in his phone cache, David does not narrate a chase. He narrates a narrowing. He names a sink and says it does not sound like water should sound. He says the canopy here is thick enough to drink, and the laurel is bright enough to make the shadows feel brittle. He says the marks are close together. Now, almost like a path that needs no map, and that he understands the joke of it and does not find it funny. He says very softly that he does not believe in monsters, that people are enough. By dusk, the search teams had pushed within earshot of each other and then lost the sound again in the folds of the hollow. Sheriff Hanley called the state for a larger response, and someone in the group text to the newsroom used the red siren emoji that office people use when they are trying to talk about distance. Ellen booked a rental car and started driving through the night, and Marcus found himself walking the perimeter of his kitchen like a man in an airport who has misread a gate number and no longer trusts signs. That night, a pair of teenagers parked. Above the overlook that faces the ridge saw 3 lights far inside the dark, low and steady, as if carried at a deliberate height and not foreseeing the path. They told a deputy the lights had nothing to do with flashlights and looked more like a kind of lantern light that moves without bounce. The deputy wrote it down and told them to go home and not talk to anyone about it unless asked. He did not add it to the official report because there was not a place for it on the form. The next morning, in the broad shallow that locals call the basin, a search dog made a tight circle on a patch of ground that looked no different than the rest and then whined and sat. The handler marked the spot and looked for any sign of a fall or a hole or a break in the surface. He saw none. A geologist with the state later pointed to a feature on an old survey that suggested a sinkhole had once been there and had been plugged by a decades-old slide. Water finds what it needs sooner or later, the geologist said, and so do people, who learn where the ground is hollow. Those who were born in the hills and learned their rules by osmosis do not speak about a tribe in the sense outsiders understand the word, with a taxonomy or an origin story that outsiders get to write down. They speak about families who chose the kind of privacy that feels to others like a dare. They speak about a circle of obligation that was once religious and then became something less easy to name. They speak about keepers of a boundary that no longer has a visible fence. They do not name them for strangers. They call them the ones who keep to the inside and keep the inside from spilling out. Claire Whitford offered context to those who would listen after David vanished, and she did it with her habit of separating what can be known from what can only be guessed. She said that in regions where geography enforces its law, groups form that bend around it. They may borrow a little theology and a little superstition and a little economy, and then compound it into a code. She said that when you step across a code like that without knowing it, the code treats you as if you are not a person so much as a sentence that must be completed. It will finish you grammatically. What we can say is that David was marked. Not in the sense of ink or scar, not in a way that leans on drama. He was marked by choices placed like stones, by a set of hands that have practiced steering objects, and animals and people through tight country. He was marked by the circle and the petals, which in the vocabulary of that inside carries the plain message of a lid. This space is covered, it says, and you are beneath the lid now whether you believe in lids or not. We can also say that when they came to him, they did not step from the trees so much as they resolved from what he had already been seeing. The record has no image of them. It has impressions, tall and short both, a range of bodies like any group. Cloth and bark both, a practical wrapping that could be hung to dry and taken up again. A gray dust on skin that reads as ash when it is not. Ash exactly, more like clay or powdered stone. No face paint in the theatrical sense. No ornaments that would make a cameraman happy. No sound of chant or rehearsal. Just presence, collected like water at the lowest point. The inside does not use weapons that make noise. The inside uses rope, and leverage and a confidence with slope that feels like magic to anyone who learned to walk on flat streets. The inside knows how to turn a step into a stumble, and a stumble into a kneel without touching a shoulder. The inside does not run. There is no run when the path is a throat. What happened beside the sink was not a spectacle. The ground opened in the quiet way ground does when it is not sure whether it means to be water or stone. David would have seen the edge just as he felt the control leave his legs. He would have grabbed for the root or the branch that others had already tested and left weak. He might have shouted a single name or a single word that had meaning only for him. He would have met eyes, because people meet eyes even when everything else is beyond their reach. There are traces on fabric and traces on bark, and there is a narrow groove where a heel dragged and a place in the dirt where a knee tried to cut purchase. Then there is the black in which the ground keeps its last positions. There are old rules about death in closed codes. They do not look like ours, and they do not need to. Bodies become a problem that must be solved without import from the outside. A sink is a solution that also reads to the code as a return. Water is a mouth, and the mouth closes. There are no knives in any report, no gunshot, no image that would qualify as proof for television. There is a man who went where others did, not go and met a law he could not see. There is a place that takes what it has been taught to take. Weeks later, the weather broke. The creek lines fattened with runoff and the leaf color moved from bright to rust. Hunters took to the edges and then to the deeper roots and said little about what they saw because they always say little. A storm, shoved against the ridge as if it meant to move land and not just air, and water made dew. In a late summer drought the following year, a boy and his uncle picking through sinkholes for drifted branches saw a bit of fabric caught in a snag near a lip of stone and pulled it up with a hook because that is what you do with lost things in the hills. They looked twice and then looked away and called the sheriff. The rest is the paperwork that follows any recovery. Dental matches and a call from Ellen that ended without words, and a funeral back in a city that did not understand the difference between ridge and mountain and did not need to. The search never turned into a case with names. Sheriff Hanley would say later that he knew when a thing was closed long before the office recognized that it could not be opened. He had no suspects to question and no one to warn, because the warning itself would have drawn outsiders into the very place that does not want outsiders. He kept a map with 3 pins and a circle drawn with a hand that refused to steady. He locked that map in a drawer because he did not want it to live on a wall where someone could take a picture and pass it around as a dare. Ellen published what she could publish within the ethical bounds she still believed in. Her piece reads like a report and not a horror story because that is what she knows how to write. She did not use the word tribe because the word would have told the wrong story. She used the word code and the word boundary and the phrase private people. She wrote that an experienced reporter entered a closed place and failed to understand that he had been made into an errand for someone else's belief. She wrote that the cost of understanding sometimes exceeds the value of what you learn. Her headline did not sing. She kept it flat and let the text carry the grief. Marcus visited the ridge months later, against his better judgment and against the advice of anyone from there. He parked at the last public turnout and walked only as far as the first switchbacks because he did not owe the hills anything and did not want them to think he did. He left a small laminated card wedged into a crack of stone with David's name and the word friend on it, as if a place could read English and understand that a life does not belong entirely to its ending. He stood with his hands in his pockets and felt the ridge change temperature like a living thing, and then he left because leaving is a skill that saves more people than courage ever has. Claire continued her work and added the case to a lecture about ethics. She said we hunger for the notion of a tribe because it simplifies the work of building a narrative. She said we are not owed a map to every room inside another person's house. She said the hills teach a lesson about secrecy that cities forget. When the land can erase a path by morning, you learn to share your rules only with those who already know them. Roy kept his counsel in the manner of men who have no need to prove what they know. Once, late in the day as the sky washed itself into a plain gray, He stood with a stateman at the edge of a stand of laurel and watched a ribbon of lighter color move in a slow arc across the understory. It was only the breeze or a drift of seed fluff or something that has never needed a name. He nodded toward it and said, "There is your line." The stateman did not understand and did not ask, and the line passed without a sound we could map. As for the ones who keep to the inside, this account offers them neither villainy nor absolution. The record does not know how they tell the story to their children, or if they do. Perhaps the story is taught as caution, a reminder that the lid must be kept and that where the water goes is not for the outside to decide. Perhaps it is not a story at all on that side of the boundary, only a practice repeated until it does not need words. Outsiders like words. Insiders like the absence of need. There is an image that returns at the end of any effort to write this down. It is not the sink or the ridge or the symbol. It is not David's face in the last photograph. It is the blank between painted marks on bark, the space the eye learns to read as much as the paint, the space in which choice once lived and then did not. The hills do not hate or love. They offer only their grammar. On the inside of that grammar, the hunt is not a chase but a completion of a sentence that began long before any of us arrived. People in town still park at the overlook and light cigarettes and drift into the kind of talk that circles without landing. They talk about weather patterns and timber rights and a cousin who left and a cousin who came back with a secret he never told. Every so often, someone will say the circle and the petals, and someone else will pretend not to hear. The conversation moves on because it has to. The feed store opens at dawn. School buses still drag their yellow through the valley. The hounds sleep on the porch and blink at the morning as if the morning were new. The ridge is where it has always been. The ridge does not move. The people who live at its base learn to. If you have listened this far, you may want someone to say that there is a moral or at least a rule you can write on a sticky note and hold on your monitor. There is not. There is only a record of a man who wanted to see something clearly and found himself seen instead. He was marked by a code older than his questions. He stepped inside a sentence and became its object. Those who loved him will carry that grammar for the rest of their lives and will interrupt its clauses with whatever kindness they can find. The last line we can write without pretending to certainty is the plain one. David Holloway went into the hills. He was hunted down according to rules he did not consent to and was killed by people who do not need a word we can use without causing harm. He is buried where his family can visit him without crossing anyone else's boundary. The hills keep their secret because that is what they have always done. The circle is a lid. The petals face inward. The sentence closes.